A young lady climbs out of a window dressed in men's clothing with a pistol and her pet dog in hand. She meets another young lady also dressed in men's clothing, and they ride into the night towards the coast with plans of their new life together abroad. Hello and welcome to the 7th episode of Amorous Histories. I'm Annie Harrison, your resident history nerd for the next half an hour. As you can hear, I'm ill again, so please excuse my raspy tones. Thank you to everyone who has supported me with social media follows, likes and shares. I've been feeling the love recently and I'm both surprised and grateful. If you're new, hopefully you'll like what you hear and help spread the word. And if you haven't already found my social media pages, I'm at Amorous Histories on Instagram and Facebook and at Amorous Hist Pod on Twitter. You can find the transcripts and sources for each show on my website with the fresh and very professional new URL, amoroushistories.co.uk. And if you like your podcasts available on YouTube, I've started uploading episodes to my channel, which is also unsurprisingly called Amorous Histories. Please do leave stars and reviews on whichever podcast app you listen to me on, because as every other podcaster says, it really helps the ratings. According to the internet, reaching episode 7 means I've beaten Podfade. Apparently 7 is the magic number, and if you make it this far, you'll probably keep going. So that's good news. 7 doesn't sound like much, but a lot of work goes into making an episode. Whether it's a history podcast like mine or a comedy chat show, there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. Which is why it feels so sweet when you hit little milestones. I recently hit over 700 listens to the podcast and over 600 reads of my website. So thank you to everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Ladies of Llangollen, an 18th century queer couple. I've had this on my episode list from the start, along with the story of Anne Lister. The TV series Gentleman Jack, which is based on Anne Lister, has just returned, so I wanted to go gay for this episode. But I knew that if I did cover Anne Lister, I'd probably get drowned out by everyone else doing exactly the same. So instead, let's supplement the discussion around Anne Lister and Anne Walker by meeting Sarah Ponsonby and Eleanor Butler. But before we go any further, I have to clarify some terms. The Ladies of Llangollen were not lesbians, because no one was a lesbian in the 18th century. You could be a lesbian if you were from the Greek island of Lesbos, but that didn't have anything to do with fancying women. So the historian in me can't call them lesbians. I could perhaps call them Tommies, Rubsters or Flats, all of which were slang used in the 18th century or earlier to refer to women who were involved romantically or sexually with other women. When talking about historical same-sex desire, a lot of people seem to tend towards the word queer. We talk about queer history, queer literature, queer fashion, etc. If gay, lesbian, trans is inappropriate because of the time period being discussed, then queer seems to be a good word to represent those in history who weren't heterosexual, cisgender, or people we would call quote-unquote heteronormative. Although queer does have its own complications and baggage, but that's a whole other story. So today you'll hear me refer to the ladies as queer because that's how I'm reading their relationship. And if you want to make a drinking game out of this episode, maybe drink every time I say queer and let me know how you're doing at the end. In episode 4, we talked about molly culture and being a queer man in 18th century London. Some of the people we learn about were tried, imprisoned, and executed for sodomy or for their involvement with queer men. So, was it the same for women who loved or slept with other women? The short answer is no. In England, it was not and has never been illegal for consenting women to have sex with women. By consenting, I also mean above the legal age of consent. On his website, Victor Norton writes, "There have been no laws against lesbians in England and America." And he goes on to quote Louis Crompton, who said, "In Europe before French Revolution, however notably in countries as France, Spain, Italy, Germany and Switzerland, Lesbian acts were regarded as legally equivalent to acts of male sodomy and were, like them, punishable by the death penalty. On occasions, executions of women were carried out, but Norton notes that, quote, such instances were rare, and laws which formerly existed on the statute books were seldom enforced in practice. The ladies of Llangollen were subject to English laws as they lived in Wales, so they didn't have to hide their relationship like queer men did for fear of prosecution. The story of the ladies of Llangollen begins in Ireland. Lady Eleanor Charlotte Butler, the older of the two by 16 years, was born in 1739. She was a member of the Butler family, the Earls of Ormond, as the daughter of Walter Butler, the 16th Earl of Ormond, and Eleanor Moores. The family seat was Kilkenny Castle in County Kilkenny, South East Ireland. But as was fashionable at the time for high society families, she was educated in a convent in France. Sarah Ponsonby was born in 1755, the daughter of Chambray Barbazon Ponsonby and Louisa Lyons. Sarah was orphaned as a child and lived with her relatives, Sir William and Lady Betty of Woodstock, in County Kilkenny. Sir William and Lady Betty decided to educate Sarah at Park's boarding school in Kilkenny, where she would have met Eleanor. Laurie Moriarty notes in her talk, The Lives and Afterlives of the Ladies of Llangollen, that when the pair met, Sarah would have been 13 and Eleanor would have been 29. Their friendship continued for 10 years before they first attempted to leave Ireland for England, when Sarah was 23 and Eleanor was 39, with neither of them married. On the night of Monday the 30th of March, 1778, Sarah, dressed in men's clothing, carrying a pistol and her dog Frisk, snuck out of a window at Woodstock and met Eleanor, who had ridden 15 miles from Kilkenny Castle, also dressed in men's clothing. The pair then made their way 23 miles to Waterford, where they had planned to catch a boat to England. Unfortunately, despite their apparent planning, they missed the boat and had to spend the night in a barn. By the time the morning had come around, the families had found them and taken them home, Sarah with a serious fever. Both families were upset and shocked by the women's attempt to travel to England. In a letter to her family friend, Mrs. Goddard, Sarah's relative, Lady Betty, writes that, quote, there was no man concerned for either of them, meaning that they weren't running off to be with men, which was of great relief to both families. Sarah had revealed that her and Eleanor had long been planning to travel to England and live together, which sounds pretty queer to me. You may be wondering, if all of this is so respectable and platonic, then why did they scheme and hide their move to England? Well, Sarah was 23, so she was ripe to be married off to a suitable wealthy man, but it transpires that her guardian, Sir William, had actually proposed marriage to her, even though his wife, Lady Betty, was still alive. From Sarah's letters, historians have learnt that Sir William had said to Sarah that once Lady Betty was dead, he had planned on marrying her, which is just a horrific proposal. Lady Betty is still alive and well, for one thing, let alone the fact that he's old and had been charged with her care when she became an orphan at age 7. So yeah, that's what Sarah was running from. As for Eleanor, she had sort of the opposite problem. She was 39 and unmarried. Her family were about to pack her off to the convent in France where she had been educated so she could become a nun. Despite all of the fun a queer woman could have had in a nunnery, Eleanor clearly didn't like the sound of that plan. Perhaps because she had already found the person she wanted to spend the rest of her life with, Sarah Ponsonby. After the escape attempt, the two families prevented the women from seeing each other. Sarah's family thought that Eleanor was leading her astray, and Mrs. Goddard, the family friend mentioned earlier, visited Sarah to try and dissuade her from attempting to travel to England again, telling her that Eleanor had, quote, a debauched mind. And that sounds like straight person talk for queer to me. About 3 weeks after their failed escape, Eleanor manages to break out of the property where her family had been keeping her, which was Boris House, about 12 miles from Woodstock, where she travelled to and hid in Sarah's room for 2 days with the help of a domestic servant, Mary Carroll. I need a gay alarm or something because come on.
Oh my god, lesbians.
Eventually, for reasons that don't appear to be clear, both families stop fighting against the women's wishes and agree to allow them to move to England together and to pay them an annual allowance on which to live. In May 1778, just 2 months after women had snuck out of their homes, Sarah and Eleanor were on their way to England to start a new life together, along with Mary, the servant who had helped them. The two women travelled around Wales and part of England on a sort of mini tour before settling in Llangollen, leasing a cottage in 1780. We know all about this time of their lives from sources such as Sarah's journal, which she entitled Account of a Journey in Wales, performed in May 1778 by two fugitive ladies and dedicated to her most tenderly beloved companion by the author. I feel like Sarah is being a bit tongue-in-cheek there, referring to herself and Eleanor as fugitives. Did she feel like they were fleeing persecution or judgment, perhaps? Or that their behaviour could be seen as criminal? Also, I'd love to see a compare and contrast of Sarah and Eleanor's diaries and letters with Anne Lister's to see if you could read any queer language or coding used by both parties. And by queer coding, I don't mean how Lister wrote in code, but did they, for example, have words with double meanings that were known only to the queer community? Someone must have written something on that. If you're shouting at me right now because you know of a piece of work that does exactly that, then please let me know. I'm not affiliated to a university or institution, so I've got no access to the articles kept behind paywalls. If I miss something, it's not for want of trying, it's just capitalism doesn't swing in my favour. It's at this point that I should probably plug that I set up a Buy Me a Coffee account, which is buymeacoffee.com/Amorous Histories pod, so that I could fund research to this podcast, because currently all of my money goes to our gas and electricity supplier. There's no pressure, I just set it up because, well, various reasons, which I'm sure I can talk about in another blog if people care to listen or read. Anyway, Sarah and Eleanor have now settled in Llangollen. They've got their little cottage, Plasnewid, and they're living out their dreams. Hold your horses, because it's about to get really gay again. They spent their time renovating the cottage into a Gothic style. They improved their gardens, curated a library. Eventually they had a 9-acre farm with 4 cows, and apparently, don't quote me on this, they had a dog or a succession of dogs named Sappho. Now, if that doesn't sound like the ultimate lesbian cottagecore fantasy, then I don't know what does. It is important to note that Eleanor and Sarah were both educated upper-class women from wealthy families with titles and land. So the way in which their situation plays out is really aided by the fact that they have so much privilege on their side, especially compared to the Mollys and the queer men we spoke about in episode 4. The ladies had wanted to live in what they called seclusion. However, the novelty of their living situation made them somewhat of a tourist attraction. In The Art of the Wasted Day, Patricia Hampel wrote, quote, "During the ladies' long years in their home, it seems just about everyone beat a path to their heavily ornamented Gothic door of their remote cottage. Wordsworth and Southey composed poems under its low roof. Both Shelley and Byron turned up to talk and stare, apparently flummoxed by the orderly cloister life of the ladies. Charles Darwin came as a child in the company of his father. Lady Caroline Lamb, the novelist and lover of Lord Byron, and a distant relative of Sarah, made a visit, as did Sir Walter Scott, even the Duke of Wellington, a treasured friend, and De Quincey, coldly received. On and on the personages of the age made pilgrimage to the isolated Welsh village on the River Dee. Josiah Wedgwood visited the ladies to tour the opine about the rock formations of the surrounding savage landscape. The poet Anna Seward visited and corresponded with the ladies. Various royals from the continent also made the pilgrimage. The aunt of Louis XVI, Prince Esterhazy from Budapest. Coming and going, the aristocrats paid wistful or baffled homage to a way of life rare in its independence and chosen affection." End quote. Unsurprisingly, queer women such as Anna Seward, Anne Lister, and her lover Mariana Belcombe gravitated towards the ladies. They inspired some of Seward's writing, most notably the poem Llangollen Vale, and Anne and Mariana spent time trying to figure out if Sarah and Eleanor were in a romantic relationship. In one letter to Anne, Mariana asked, quote, "Tell me if you think their regard has always been platonic, and if you ever believed pure friendship could be so exalted. If you do, I shall think there are brighter amongst mortals than I ever believed there were." Anne replied, saying, "I cannot help think that surely it was not platonic. Heaven forgive me, but I look within myself and doubt. I feel the infirmity of our nature and hesitate to pronounce such attachments uncemented by something more tender still than friendship." So they got Anne Lister's gaydar pinging. It's thought that Anne Lister's visit to the ladies in July 1822 further proved to her that women could live together as lovers. It wasn't only queer women who suspected the ladies' relationship wasn't purely platonic. In July 1790, 3 London newspapers speculated on their living situation. In the St. James's Chronicle, an article titled "Extraordinary Female Affection" was published. The opening paragraph wasn't messing around, saying, quote, "Miss Butler and Miss Ponsonby, now retired from the society of men into the wilds of a certain Welsh vale, bear a strange antipathy to the male sex, whom they take every opportunity of avoiding." The article goes on to describe the ladies, quote, "Miss Butler is tall and masculine. She wears always a riding habit, hangs up her hat with the air of a sportsman in the hall, and appears all respects a young man, if we except the petticoat which she still retains. Miss Ponsonby, on the contrary, is polite and effeminate, fair and beautiful. Miss Ponsonby does the duties and honours of the house, while Miss Butler superintends the garden and the rest of the grounds." This was clearly an attempt to force the women into heteronormative roles of husband and wife, which still happens to queer couples today. They've decided to characterise Eleanor as the man, wearing a riding habit and doing the gardening, while Sarah is the woman, managing the house. The description of her as effeminate, fair and beautiful conjures the stereotypical images of late 18th century women in dresses. We know that this is not true though. From the accounts we have of them, we know that both Eleanor and Sarah favoured riding habits. In her diary, Anne Lister wrote of Sarah, quote, "A large woman, so as to waddle in walking, but though not taller than myself, in a blue, shortish waisted cloth habit, the jacket unbuttoned, showing a plain plaited frilled habit shirt, a thick white cravat rather loosely put on, hair powdered parted, I think, down the middle in front, cut a moderate length, all around and hanging straight, tolerably thick, the remains of a very fine face, coarsish white cotton stockings, lady slipper shoes cut low down, the foot hanging a little over, altogether a very odd figure, mild and gentle, certainly not masculine, and yet there was a je ne sais quoi striking." I can't help but hearing that in Saran Jones's voice from Gentleman Jack. Right. The few contemporary images we have on them also represent them in what has been variously described as conservative dress. There was an 1828 sketch by Mary Parker that I'll share on my social media of the ladies in their library, and strangely, Eleanor is shown wearing the Order of St. Louis, a French order of chivalry awarded to exceptional officers. There's plenty more that can be said about their fashion choices, but sadly I just don't have time to squeeze it in. As well as misrepresenting their dress, the St. James's Chronicle article also divides their domestic roles. We know that they shared responsibilities, gardening and managing the household together, along with help from their servant Mary. Improving Plasnewid was their joint project. The Extraordinary Female Affection article was reproduced, slightly edited, in the General Evening Post and the London Chronicle a few days after the original was published. Sarah and Eleanor didn't take kindly to this report, and they wrote to Edmund Burke inquiring what legal action could be pursued. He tells them just to ignore the newspapers, quote, "The rest of the world will not be in the smallest degree influenced it," but we know that just isn't true. There is so much to talk about when it comes to the Ladies of Llangollen. I quickly want to touch on their belongings. The books in their library were embossed with their initials, EB on the front and SP on the back.
Oh my god, lesbians.
The British Museum holds a pair of chocolate cups, covers, and saucers owned by the ladies. The chocolate cups have a view of Plasnewid on one side and the arms of the Butler and Ponsonby families on the other, and each saucer is monogrammed.
Oh my god, lesbians.
I think if you, at this point, still consider that they were hashtag just friends, I just, this just is, it's really gay. Really gay. After 50 years together, Eleanor passed away in 1829 and Sarah soon followed in 1831. They never returned to Ireland. They were buried together with Mary Carroll, who had died in 1810. A three-sided Gothic monument marks the women's final resting place in St Column's Churchyard in Llangollen, Wales. Now, I really have run out of time. There's just so much I haven't talked about, including Mary Carroll, the women's own writing, architecture, politics, and the good old-fashioned "they were just good friends" debate. This is just supposed to be an informed and interesting overview of the ladies' lives. And if you want to learn more, I fully encourage you to do so. I'm going to leave you with Eleanor's diary entry from Thursday the 22nd of September, 1785. Quote, "Up at 7, dark morning, all the mountains enveloped in mist, thick rain, a fire in the library, delightfully comfortable, breakfast at 8:30, from 9 till 1 writing, my beloved drawing Pembroke Castle, from 1 till 3 read to her, after dinner went hastily around the gardens, rained without interruption the entire day, from 4 till 10 reading to my Sally, she drawing, from 10 till 11 sat over the fire conversing with my beloved, a silent, happy day." I hope you enjoyed spending time with the Ladies of Llangollen. If you're interested in finding out more, I really recommend Laurie Moriarty's talk on their lives and afterlives. A link to that video will be on my website. If you like this episode, please leave Amorous Histories a little review or some stars on your podcast app or website. You should be able to find me wherever you get your podcasts, even YouTube. You can also follow my socials at Amorous Histories on Instagram and Facebook and at Amorous Hispod on Twitter. Transcripts and sources are at amoroushistories.co.uk. Please feel free to DM me or email me amoroushistories@gmail.com if you have any questions, episode suggestions, or you want to collab. And until next time, stay sexy.